Hello and welcome to our screencast. Today we are going to introduce our next unit, which is Big Error 3, concerning farming and the emergence of complex societies. The time period we're looking at is between 10,000 and 1000 BCE. Okay, so our unit objectives are listed out here. We'll talk more about these in person, but please note that these are the unit objectives, not just this lesson or this introduction objectives. Again, we'll talk more about those in person. Okay, so our big question, our big inquiry question for this particular unit is how might we create an ideal civilization? Now, that's a big question, and we can't begin to answer it until we understand what a civilization is. So today we are going to look at the components of a civilization, the elements, how a civilization even came to be. So here we go. All right, so we just ended our study of Big Error 2, right, which stretched all the way back to 200,000 years ago when human beings first started popping up, and will stretch until the beginning of this particular Big Error 3, right, at 10,000 years ago. So this image highlights key elements of Big Error 2, right? So what are the big, huge, monumental changes that occur from 200,000 BCE to 10,000 BCE, right? So take a look at that. This is review, so hopefully you can start spotting things right off the bat. But all right, here we go. So again, the time period we're looking at is Big Error 3, right? And so at the beginning of this is 10,000 years ago. What are the changes that we saw that happened in the previous 190,000 years? Well, here they are, right? So first and foremost, humans started to appear on Earth. Those humans are going to develop language. They're going to migrate all over the place, right? So their habitats expand. And the technology that they use is going to become more intricate. It's going to multiply. And art's going to develop during this time period too, right? You're going to see some wall painting, some sculpture, that kind of stuff. So again, that's all review, right? We've talked about that before. So the big question that I want to pose for you is that was Big Error 2. Now we're in Big Error 3. And so if that previous image symbolized Big Error 2, this collection of images symbolizes Big Error 3. So here's the big question, right? How did we get from, or first of all, do you note any differences? Of course you do, right? I mean, anybody can note that there's some pretty monumental changes there. So the question then becomes, how did we get from, right, the end of Big Error 2 to the end of Big Error 3? There's a lot of stuff that's going to happen, and we're going to talk about all of that today. So if you haven't already, make sure you go to iTunes U and download your unit guide, and that is going to help guide you in taking your notes, right? So there's a graphic organizer on there and such. So here we go. Okay, so one of the major changes that's going to occur is reflected in this particular frieze, which was found on a wall in Mesopotamia, which is today Iraq, right? And that is that it reflects the domestication of two things. One, animals, and two, plants. Okay, so the domestication of plants and animals, again, was a monumental change. It resulted in a completely new way of living, known as farming, right? And so this farming is going to consist of two main things. One is going to be animals, right? So pastoralism, the herding of sheep, goats, cattle, horses, camels, those type of animals. And then also the domestication of plants, right? So we're going to grow some crops. And together, those things are going to create what are known as farming communities. And farming communities don't confuse with actual civilizations, right? So this is kind of a stepping stone to that, but it's not an actual civilization, not yet. We're going to talk about how farming communities lead to civilization. Interestingly enough, about between the years 12,000 and 1000 BCE, we're going to see farming appear in a whole bunch of different places around the globe. And it's interesting because they're independent of each other, right? So because farming emerges in China, doesn't necessarily mean that farming emerges in Ethiopia. It happens that way, right? But they're not connected. It's not like people from China travel to Ethiopia and say, hey, let's start some farming. So these happen independent of one another. Let's see here. Prior to farming, population in any given area is going to be limited to the amount of food that's available, right? So if you're hunting, it's going to be the wild game. If you're gathering, how much grain, berries, seeds, nuts can you gather, right? And that's going to depend on how big your population gets. Because if you have more population than there is food, unfortunately, people will die of starvation. And so when you change to farming, suddenly you have a large, relatively dependable amount of food, and that's going to lead to population intensification, meaning that your population can increase because the amount of food that you have available for people to eat also increases. And so at the same time that population is increasing, surprisingly, farmers are able to still grow what are known as a surplus food or food surplus. And so I want you to stop for a moment and think about, what does a surplus food production mean for society? That's a big question. All right. So, have any ideas floating in your head? What does a surplus food production mean for society? Well, if you were thinking that it could potentially lead to something known as job specialization, you were right. So what do we mean by that? Well, what we mean is that suddenly not everybody has to be concerned with growing enough food to survive. Right now, just a portion of our population has to think about growing that food. And so what do we do with the rest of our population that doesn't have to have their life revolve around food in some way, shape, or form, right? Food production. And so that's where this notion of job specialization comes in. And so now men and women don't all have to be farmers. They can branch out and become other things like weavers, stonemasons, potters, priests, scribes, traders, army officers. And this is going to have a profound impact on the society that people are living in. So instead of being a farming community where everybody's job is to work from dawn to dusk on making sure that we have enough food, suddenly we're able to expand that. So let's recap what we just talked about, because something pretty monumental just unfolded. And so if you look at your graphic organizers, let's go ahead and fill that out, right? So we start off with the domestication of plants and animals. This leads to farming. Now, what are the things that we just talked about that can occur specifically because farming has become a practice? Well, if you're thinking along the lines of population intensification, surplus food, and job specialization, then you would be correct. Now, here's the final question, right? So what do these three things lead to? Yeah, I know you said it, a complex society. And this can also be known as a civilization. Very good. Okay, so here's the simplistic definition of a civilization, right? So it's a complex society. We just said that in the other slide. But that's as simple as we can put it. Now let's go a little more in depth, right? So there are certain elements that are common among all civilizations, right? And so let's take a look at those elements right now. The first two are going to be cities and laws. And so in every civilization, right, you're going to have big population centers, okay? And in order to keep kind of order in those big population centers, right, we have to have rules, also known as laws. And so we're going to see civilizations emerge with governments that create rules and enforce those rules, okay? In addition to those two things, cities and central governments and law codes, we are also going to see the emergence of writing and record keeping, in addition to highly organized religions. Okay, so there's 4 of the 7 elements that we're going to talk about: cities, governments, writing and record keeping, highly organized religion, and don't forget about specialized jobs, right? So people can branch out and do more than just food production. In addition to that, we're going to see the emergence of social classes. This is entirely new, right? So when we're hunters and gatherers, there are no social classes, right? Everybody's on equal footing here. But that's going to change as soon as we develop civilization. Okay, and the final component of a civilization, the final element, any guesses as to what it might be? Yep, I think I heard you say it, right? Complex technologies. And so early on, that might look like a chariot or even a bronze sword. Okay, and as we move through time, our technologies are going to become more complex. Okay, so let's measure how well you've been paying attention versus how much you've just been drifting off. Okay, so can you go ahead and list, cover up your paper, right? Don't look at it. Can you recall the elements of a civilization? And here's your clue. There's 7 of them. All right, so why don't I give you 10 seconds? Okay, did you get them? Well, let's find out, right? So here they are. If your list includes the following, then you did well. Cities, a central government, and law codes, writing and record keeping, specialized jobs, social classes, complex technologies, and highly organized religions. Okay, I'm assuming you got those all because I believe in you. So, not only did life change in regards to like the culture and the technology, but it also changed in that change happened more rapidly. It started to accelerate. And that is going to be a constant theme throughout our study of history, is how rapid change is going to occur. So if we look back at, right, Big Era 2, there's 2 big changes, right? We start to see language develop and art takes form. But here in Big Era 3, look at all of the major changes, the developments that take place in a relatively short period of time in comparison to the almost 200,000 years that Big Era 2 was, right? So again, that rapid change is going to continue to accelerate as we move through our study of history. Okay, so what do you need to do? Well, when you show up tomorrow, you should be prepared to answer questions around the following content. Okay, so you should be able to name the 5 changes that occurred during Big Era 2. That first opening image that we looked at, right, the one that was symbolic of Big Era 2, we talked about 5 changes that image portrayed. Make sure that you know what they are. You should know the domestication of plants and animals and how that led to a complex civilization, right? So you should understand that chart, that flow, that graphic, okay, that flow chart there. You should be able to define a civilization and describe the 7 elements that is common among all civilizations. And then finally, just be able to describe the importance, right, the significance of the domestication of plants and animals, and then the importance of population intensification, surplus food, and job specialization. Okay. All right. Well, I look forward to seeing you tomorrow, and make sure you pay attention to these elements because we will have some form of a quiz tomorrow when you show up to class. All right. Bye.